In this episode, I'd like to deal with things that may be considered in some ways mundane, but actually are far more complicated, which is essentially, how does a bill become law?
Well, there's a kind of a nuts and bolts to this. There's a whole complex world of how legislation actually occurs, but let's look at it from a civic standpoint to start. The Constitution requires that both houses of Congress pass an identical bill. So let's just say that the House of Representatives wants to create a new ship, and it appropriates X million dollars for it, and they state that the ship has to be called the House of Representatives. The Senate then looks at that same bill, it creates its own version of it and says, we're not going to call it the House of Representatives, it has to be called the Senate. So now this can't be law, even if the ship is going to be identical in size, weight, cost. If there's a discrepancy between the two bills passed by the two houses of Congress, it can't become law. So then we have what's called a conference committee, in which they meet and try to work out the differences and eventually come to terms with it and produce two identical laws, one from the House and one from the Senate. Then and only then does it go to the president, who can either sign it into law or he can veto it or let it silently become law. But this is a very interesting provision of our Constitution, that if you had a unicameral system, they could create a law about a new ship and just name it what they please, and the president would then have to respond. But under our system, you have to create parallel tracks in the House and the Senate. And this often leads to frustration, because a bill today is a very complex thing. But it does just what the Founding Fathers intended. It means that the Senate can say, wait a minute, we're not so sure we like that idea. If we're going to take care of a ship in Connecticut, maybe we also need to make sure that parts of it were built in North Carolina, so that the two entities can slow down each other and create a kind of a dialogue which would not necessarily occur in a unicameral system. So then it goes to the president. In the early republic, the Founding Fathers believed that a president should only veto that which he regarded as unconstitutional. Jefferson advised President Washington, even if you dislike the policy, you sign the bill unless you regard it as unconstitutional. Jefferson was president for 8 years, he never vetoed a bill. Later, presidents began to veto over policy questions, not just constitutional questions. So if the president does veto a bill, that's not the end of the story, of course. If both houses of Congress by a 2/3 majority vote to override that veto, then it automatically becomes law and the president no longer has any capacity to stop it. Now, in the late 20th century, President Nixon said, you can pass a bill over my veto, but I'm not going to spend the money. You can't make me spend the money. I'm going to impound the money. And more recent presidents have used what are called signing statements to say, I'll sign the bill even though I don't like it, but I'm going to make clear my objections in a signing statement, a paragraph that I write explaining why I find it so odious.
Now, your original example here is a single ship.
Right.
But bills today are rarely a single issue. They are these huge omnibus bills. People refer to them as Christmas trees, especially the must-pass bills. When did this concept come up?
Oh, it came up pretty early, because the Constitution is sort of written for a simple society. But no society is ever very simple. If it's Switzerland, it's one thing. But it's not Switzerland. It's New Hampshire and New York and Carolina and Georgia and Virginia, and some of these are slave states and some are non-slave states, and you have industrial states and agricultural states. And from the very beginning, the country was more complex than the Constitution that we use to govern it, and it's just gotten more so every decade since. And so at a certain point, you couldn't just have a bill for this ship and that naval yard and that army installation and that foreign policy initiative. We began to cluster legislation in logical ways. Let's do all of the armed services under one bill. Let's do agriculture under one bill. Let's do transportation. That makes a sort of sense. But then at some point people realized, oh, the president would never sign the bill about the boat, so we'll write a bill about agriculture, which we know he has to sign, and then we'll just add some things into it that he will therefore either ignore, they'll kind of slip under the radar, or even if he objects to them, he can't veto them because he would have to veto the big bill. And if he vetoes the big bill, the government of the United States grinds to a halt. And so this is the creation of the omnibus bill with sort of either secret or specialty projects is now a standard feature of American life and a source of enormous frustration. If we had a rational system and the president could veto anything that he objected to,
a line item veto,
we would save trillions of dollars in taxpayer money. But the country has shown no real willingness to grant the president a line item veto. That would require a constitutional amendment. The chances of that amendment passing approach zero. And so we have this system in which at the last second, senators and representatives can shovel in all sorts of interesting things, and the president has to sort of hold his nose and sign the bill. There's a famous instance of this, if I can take a minute to tell you about it. When Theodore Roosevelt was president, he was using his executive authority that was given to him by the Congress to designate national forests. He was our greatest conservationist president, and he designated all sorts of national forests, 150 million acres worth. And finally, some of the lumber interests got upset by this, and they convinced some senators from the Northwest, from California and Oregon and Washington, to try to stop him. And so Charles Fulton, a senator from Oregon, put a provision in a big omnibus agricultural bill that the president had to sign, forbidding him from naming any more national forests in 6 northwestern states. Roosevelt was very angry because there was an existing law that enabled the president to declare national forests, but these senators had decided to stop him by putting this rider on a fundamentally important agricultural bill. So Roosevelt knew he had to sign it, but he also was a great constitutionalist, and he knew that from the time that Congress sends you the bill, the president has 10 days before he has to either veto it or allow it to pass without his veto. He called in his forester, Gifford Pinchot, and said, let's get busy. And they used those 10 days to designate 16 million acres of national forest in the very states that they were trying to stop it in. And Roosevelt even added a few more just to show Senator Fulton what he had in mind. And the senators were appalled and angry. There was nothing they could do because the Constitution gives the president that 10-day period. And we cannot pass ex post facto laws under our Constitution, so they couldn't go back and undo it either.
Here's a few questions to think about and discuss. Question 1. Why did the Founding Fathers want legislation to be passed by both houses of Congress? Question 2. Should the President have a line item veto? Question 3. Should individual senators be permitted to filibuster legislation? Question 4. Jefferson believed that the President should only veto legislation that he regarded as unconstitutional. Today, presidents veto legislation they don't like for a variety of reasons. What standard should prevail? Question 5. Should the President be allowed to impound funds or use signing statements to alter the intention of legislation passed by Congress?
One of the things that these omnibus bills force is compromise, because a senator or congressperson is faced with a situation that there may be many good things for their state or what they consider for the country, and there may be some things that they consider bad, but on balance, to get anything done, they do have to compromise.
Absolutely. It's an important part of our system. If you have 50 states and just a wide variety of economic interests and geographies and demographics. And so if you're going to pass an agricultural bill, the Farm Bill, the people from the Great Plains want to have transportation issues settled there, They want drought relief. They want CRP, setting aside some acreage as grassland. The people from California don't care about any of that. They want special subsidies for dairy and so on, so that different regions have different needs and demands. And so the senator from Nebraska will say to the senator from California, boy, I really need this drought relief. And the senator from California will say, well, that doesn't really matter to us, we irrigate, but I guess I'm willing to go along with you if you also will increase our dam building project so we can bring more water to the Central Valley. And so both of them wind up sort of saying, okay, I'll do that. And this kind of horse trading goes on all the time. That's why it's very hard for a United States senator ever to become the president of the United States, because in the course of 6 or 12 or 18 years, you do so much of this where you're voting for something that you really don't believe in for a second, but you have to because that's the way legislation gets passed in this society, that you create a record of your votes that can be cherry-picked by the other party, and they'll say, oh, well, you voted for the war before you voted against the war, and you voted for ethanol, and yet now you say you're against it, and you said that you were for closing the borders, but I see that you voted for an increase in immigration on a guest worker system. Senators wind up voting in all sorts of ways that are counter to their core philosophies, because you couldn't have a Senate or a House of Representatives unless there was this give and take and compromise. And then there are earmarks, so that Senator X from Minnesota says to his colleagues, look, it's a $300 billion agricultural bill. I have this group that wants to create the world's largest cob of corn. They're going to build a 300-foot concrete cob of corn. I know it's kind of stupid, but it would really please them if I could get them $1 million. So would you mind if I earmarked a little money for that project? And the guy from Oregon says, man, what an idiotic project. But funny you should say this, because I have these people that want to build a shark tank on the Columbia River, and they think it'll be economic regeneration for this community. Would you be willing if I earmarked a little money for that? And then they all trade this out too. And in a certain way, the system works. It's messy, it's expensive, it's wasteful, it's not a republic, but it allows lots of things to get funding that are probably have some dessert and wouldn't get funded under a more rational system.
But there's an irony that has occurred in recent history, which is where earmarks now have their authors' names attached to them, because the concept was that that would shame the legislators from putting the earmarks in, when in fact what has actually happened is that now the legislators proudly proclaim that I got this money for my people, and so the earmarks have continued.
Well, the Constitution, let me say, is totally silent on this. The Founding Fathers did not intend earmarks. They didn't intend the world's largest cob of corn. They didn't intend horse trading of this sort. But horse trading has been a part of it. The famous compromise that occurred in Jefferson's era between Hamilton wanting his national financial system and the Southerners wanting the capital and the Upper South. And it's the famous bargain that occurred when Jefferson was Secretary of State. This sort of thing has always happened. It's the nature of law in every society in the world. Earmarks are a little bit different from that. The Founding Fathers didn't anticipate that with any language in the Constitution. But it works. Earmarks do work. And if every time that some senator or other says, well, I'll get rid of earmarks forever, A, they're lying, because earmarks work for everybody, for all 100 senators. And secondly, it can't be done. This is in a complex society of 50 states and 300 million people, there have to be a whole series of what might be called casual, informal mechanisms for funding in government. Otherwise, you would have an omnibus bill that was 3,000 pages long.
I want to go back to one thing you mentioned earlier, which is vetoes, and one in particular, which is the president's pocket veto. Would you explain that? Which is literally to put a bill in your pocket.
The pocket veto can only occur under one very careful circumstance. Normally, the president vetoes. He sends the bill back to the House and the Senate, and he has to send a statement of why he's vetoing it. Then, if both houses with 2/3 majorities repass the legislation, they've overridden the veto and it becomes law, end of story. But let's say the Congress sends the president a bill, like the Theodore Roosevelt Forest bill. He doesn't have to sign it. after 10 days, it becomes law if he doesn't sign it or veto it. But if he never signs the bill and never vetoes it, but Congress adjourned during the interim, that's a pocket veto. So a president, if he gets a late piece of legislation when Congress wants to adjourn, can simply do nothing with it, and the only way they can make it pass is to stay in session till those 10 days have passed. And so this only works for late legislation during a congressional session. But presidents routinely use this because then they don't have to say anything. They can just say, well, I didn't sign it, I didn't do anything, I just put it in my pocket and it passed out of the scene. Then if Congress wants to come back to it, they have to reintroduce the legislation. They can't just pick it up, they have to completely reintroduce it in the next session.
Here are some discussion questions. Question 6. Why did the Founding Fathers set the bar at 2/3 of both houses of Congress in overriding a presidential veto? Question 7. Should the Supreme Court be permitted to declare legislation unconstitutional? Under what circumstances? Question 8. How should we address the problem of omnibus bills that include such a variety of measures and regulations that it is virtually impossible to veto the bill at large? Question 9. Recently, a good deal of government spending comes from earmarks, in which senators and representatives load legislation with special funds earmarked for special projects in their districts. Is this an acceptable practice?
All right, let's go back to the Constitution and talk about war and spending legislation.
It's so interesting, Sam, because remember, the Founding Fathers were trying to create a republic, by which they meant they wanted their government to be extremely responsive to the people. After all, they had just thrown off British colonial rule because they felt they were being taxed without representation and regulated without representation, and that there was a government somewhere far away that wasn't listening to them and wasn't responsive to them. And now that they had broken with Great Britain, they weren't about to create the same kind of power in their own system. So they didn't like government, and they didn't want government to have an autonomy. They wanted it constantly to be subordinate to the people themselves. So they tried a couple of things. We know the war powers. Wars have to begin in Congress. That hasn't worked out in the course of American history because we live in so complex a world that wars usually originate in the executive, and that creates constitutional tension because the Founding Fathers said, no, wars have to be declared by the Congress of the United States. But in Article 1 of the Constitution of the United States, there are two very interesting little pieces of Republican philosophy. Article 1, Section 7 says, all bills for raising revenue, taxes, shall originate in the House of Representatives, the branch closest to the people. So that if let's say the House of Representatives raises taxes, the people don't like it, 2 years later they throw the rascals out. They wanted to make sure that tax bills started in the House, which was the branch of government that had to be most concerned about what the people felt at any given moment. It has not worked out that way in the long run, but that was an attempt to keep the purse tied very tightly to the people. Second one is Section 8. This is where the Constitution enumerates the powers of the legislative branch. It says to raise and support armies is one of its powers, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. Think of that. The Defense Department is a permanent institution in the United States with planes and navies and communication systems and bases and so on. The Founding Fathers were so frightened of war, and they wanted to keep the dogs of war tethered to the people, so that you cannot have an appropriation for military spending of any sort that isn't renewed every second year, so that the people could say, we're not doing it. We're tired of the war. You can't do this, because it says here that every military expenditure has to have a 2-year sunset clause, and it then would have to be renewed, during which there's been an election of the House of Representatives. That too hasn't worked. Imagine today if every second year the Defense Department, the Pentagon, had to shut down unless it got reauthorized. You see what the Founding Fathers were trying to get at. They were trying to solve some of the fundamental problems of British history by creating these constitutional limits. We have effectively simply ignored those limits in the course of our history.
When you look at legislation, it's really only as good as the compliance of that legislation, and yet we've seen some very striking examples, prohibition, for example, of where it didn't work and eventually had to be repealed.
And I think everybody understands that widespread use of alcohol is socially costly. Almost all domestic violence is related to alcohol. Drunk driving is a serious issue in our culture. Crime and alcohol are closely related. The Prohibition movement was part of the progressive movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and you kind of get the point of why alcohol is a problem. But it turns out that there's no point ever passing an unenforceable law. That since humankind were able to distill liquor, they've done it. Fermentation is a central part of the human experience, intoxication is. And no government on earth can really outlaw the use of intoxicants. So prohibition was sort of a noble Puritan experiment that failed, and it failed so utterly that it had to be repealed. And it's sort of a living piece of wisdom to social utopians. You can say what you want about the culture you'd like to live in, but a law is really only as good as the willingness of the people to comply with it. The same is true of speed limit laws. People will reasonably respect a speed limit law, but if it's a silly one, if it makes no sense whatsoever, there'll be widespread breaking of that law, and you'd have to have 100,000 highway patrolmen to enforce it. And so all legislation has to sort of say, will the people accept it? How far can you go? If people are paying their own taxes, under our system people do, people are basically self-assessing their taxes, what kind of an enforcement mechanism would you have to prevent cheating of any sort? So how much leeway, how much sort of gray area cheating do you allow through the IRS? Or abortion is another example. If you outlawed abortion tomorrow by a constitutional amendment, that doesn't mean abortion would go away. The cat is out of the bag on that technology. So enforcing it would become a major social issue. And so this is always a very serious problem in any society, especially when you enter a kind of a moral realm as opposed to when do you file your report realm.
And this would include things like prostitution, pornography.
Pornography is the cat that really got out of the bag. In the 1930s and 40s, pornography existed, but it was fairly tightly controlled in that bad section of town. Thanks to the creation of VHS videotapes, people no longer had to go into the porn theater, and thanks to the internet, all bets are off, and it has produced some profound social problems. I mean, the number of people who have access to pornography for whom it is, in some sense, engaged in exploitation of children or exploitation of sexual violence is just a terrifying thing in our culture. But the problem is that it is so widespread that there's no enforcement mechanism that could possibly be imagined to take care of this. And the electronification of culture that we're seeing is going to represent some very grave challenges to our constitutional order in the 21st century.
Well, and the Supreme Court has been very ambiguous on this topic.
They don't really know what to do because it doesn't do you any good to try to enforce an unenforceable law. I mean, how would you police it? How would you police cyber porn? It's beyond the possibility. And let me give you an example, though, to go back to a more classical American situation. When Theodore Roosevelt was the police commissioner of New York, there was a Sunday closing law. Lots of places had them, but New York was a city of immigrants. And these were immigrants who worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7 days a week. They were often from nations like Germany, where there's a strong sort of drinking tradition on weekends. And so when Roosevelt became police commissioner, he looked at the law and said, well, there's a Sunday closing law, and it is almost universally ignored here in New York. He said, I'm going to enforce that law. People said, why would you do that? You're going to be so unpopular, and there's no way you can enforce an unenforceable law. He said, if you have unenforced laws, it creates contempt for the idea of the law. He said the best way to get a bad law repealed is to enforce it, and then the public outcry will demand the repeal. So he enforced the Sunday closing law, and he did it with an enormous Rooseveltian delight and rigor. He used to go out at night with a hood over his head, and he would walk through the boroughs and find corrupt cops and close saloons and chastise policemen and so on. Well, finally, the German community just went nuts, and there were anti-Roosevelt demonstrations all over the city of New York. He relished this because he knew this would lead to repeal. He was finally invited to come to an anti-Roosevelt protest march. They invited him thinking, he won't show up. He goes to it. He decides, okay, I'll go. He's a man of courage. So he goes to this anti-Roosevelt parade, and he's up on the dais, and these Germans are walking down the street with anti-Roosevelt placards, and they're denouncing this Roosevelt. And finally, somebody from the crowd, not knowing that he had shown up, yells, "Where ist der Roosevelt? Where is this guy anyway?" And Roosevelt's right up there, and he says, "Ich bin here." And because he was so bold, he gained the respect of the people. They realized that he was enforcing the law because he believed in the idea of the law. He wasn't against people having a drink on Sundays, but he found it appalling that the rich have clubs where they can go on Sundays and drink, and these poor immigrants were being shut out. And so he called the bluff of an unenforceable law, and it led eventually to the liberalization of the drinking laws in New York. That's how this works. There's a dynamic between law, enforcement, and the will of the people, and these things always have to be factored in. You know, we like to think if you need to pass a law about speed limits, you just pass it, but it's not ever that simple.